Welcome. I'm so glad to see all of you here. And if I raise my hand like this at some point, maybe somebody could go get a couple more chairs, because we almost have as many chairs as we have people, so that's exciting. Welcome to Summer Issues class. The adult education team decided that this would be a good opportunity for us to reprise the very popular issues class that this congregation has been known for over the years. And so we have a full summer. Thank you to Kevin Burns, who I have learned will call anybody in the city, and has obviously great powers of communication and persuasion, because people almost always say yes to Kevin Burns. So that's really exciting. And we'll talk a bit. We picked these issues and out of our conversation, and hope that you will find them interesting. As we get started this morning, so we'll be here every Sunday morning at 9:30, except for one when we won't, but we'll give you information about that. We'll be actually, I think, across the street, but it's not till the very end, I think, of the entire series. So just plan on showing up here at 9:30. In the back on the table are prayer quilts for Jean March and Paul Freilich. Paul was a former associate pastor of this congregation and is in his 90s and simply in no emergency, just declining health due to age. So, welcome. This morning, I'm going to kick off this series by talking about why Christians care about social issues. Now, in full disclosure, I created the PowerPoint. Kevin Burns created the special effects. Why do Christians care about social issues? What do you think some answers are to that before we prowl our way through this deck of answers? Why do we care about social issues? Charlie Pye.
Because God calls us to be the hands of Jesus Christ.
Because God calls us to be the hands of Jesus Christ in the world. Okay. Other answers. Yes, ma'am.
I believe Christian people really introduce God says He wants to have order. He wants to have business. Order. He wants to work on our own.
So God wants there to be an ordered society. And an ordered society that's ordered by some values and some principles. Okay? Are there some other thoughts about why Christians care about social issues? Yes?
The Old Testament is about justice.
Pardon me?
The Old Testament is about justice.
The Old Testament in particular has a lot to say about justice. And justice is a concept, a value, that is quintessentially social, right? It is about how relationships in societies are organized and ordered. Other ideas? So there's a biblical idea, there's a theological mandate, there's a theological idea about order. There are lots of good reasons. And there's a particular Reformed or Presbyterian take on this. So we are one family within the large family of Christianity. Christians have answered the question about how to engage with society in a wide variety of ways, because Christians have been located in societies in very different ways. We come out of a branch of the Christian faith that was birthed in the Reformation in Europe in the 16th century, and then transplanted to this country in a distinctive form that we're going to consider in a few minutes. So ours is not the only answer, but it's an answer that has a particular history and trajectory. A little over 60 years ago, an American theologian by the name of H. Richard Niebuhr, who taught famously at Yale Divinity School for many, many years, wrote an incredibly influential book called Christ and Culture. In some ways, it's a dated book, but it has remained a thought-provoking way of thinking about how Christians have related to culture. Here he doesn't mean politics only, he means culture in general. And Niebuhr developed a typology of 6 different ways that he sees that Christians have engaged the question of culture. I've simplified this to the 3 that are the most, I think, discernible. In some ways, you could argue that the Christian movement and its relationship with culture began with the one in the middle, church and culture in conflict, or Christ and culture in conflict. The Christian movement was, in its very beginnings, a minority of a minority religious group inside of the Greco-Roman Empire. A minority of a minority, right? It's an offshoot of Judaism, of the faith of Israel, which was already a minority group, but a protected minority group inside of the Roman Empire. As it split off from Judaism, interestingly, Christians began to lose the protection that they enjoyed under Roman law. And Christians became persecuted minorities in many, many places. And so their way of thinking about where are we vis-a-vis the culture and the world was often one of antagonism. There's us and them. We are the persecuted small group. They are the empire. This was not paranoia on the part of the early Christians. This was the experience that they had. They controlled nothing about the political world in which they lived. They were the victims, often, of arbitrary and sometimes very intentional persecution on the part of Roman authorities. Why? Because many early Christians refused to participate in certain civic activities which in their minds were religious. The most obvious being the burning of incense at the statue of the Roman emperor, who was considered to be divine in some ways. We would call this in some ways a patriotic, and that's since there was a seamlessness of religion and culture in that world, it was just all of one thing. But Christians saw that as idolatry, refused to participate, and many were put to death as a result of this. This experience of the church's birth in a time of being over against culture is very evident in the writings of the New Testament. It's part of why Paul says, citizens, obey the government. This is not a timeless truth about politics. It's a, let's keep our heads down, ladies and gentlemen. Let's just not provoke the authorities. There's no need to do that. Pay taxes to whom taxes are due. There's some ditches that are not worth dying in, is kind of what Paul is saying there. So we have to understand when we read things like that in Paul's letters, it comes out of a very particular context. This situation of the, and I know this is cold to Newcastle, right? You guys all know all this stuff. Just to repeat it a little bit. This situation lasts until the Emperor Constantine in 323 decides that Christianity is going to move into a protected status, be an acknowledged religion, and actually be embraced as the religion of Rome. This changes everything. This changes everything. Christianity is now no longer this embattled, sectarian, semi-underground movement. It is now a flourishing center of Greco-Roman life. And over time, like over the next 700 to 1,000 years, Christianity becomes the religion of Western Europe. It becomes embedded as the faith that shapes European civilization, which leads to what Niebuhr calls Christ above culture. The notion, not so much that the church controls the state, but that the faith infuses the state. And the state supports and reinforces the Christian faith. The Christian faith shapes culture. It shapes music and art and drama and education, and it's all of a seamless whole. And for Niebuhr, the quintessential picture of this is Chartres, the cathedral at Chartres, built by who? The government, essentially, the kings. These were civic projects designed to showcase not only the power and ability of the state, but the heart of the faith itself. Okay? So this is Christ above culture, infusing everything. Enter the Reformation, and now the dissolution of that kind of easy sense that there is one church that infuses everything. And now you have competing versions of Christianity and competing versions of how it is churches are going to relate to one another, to a civil state, and now the idea of a civil state separate from the church begins to emerge. This is a new idea. It takes a long time before that begins to really flourish, but the roots of that notion of the civil state as separate from a religious base has, I think, its roots in the Reformation. Part of it you see, in fact, in Henry VIII's split with the Vatican over the question of his marriage, and thus who gets to decide civil affairs inside of England. The Reformed voice is one voice in the Reformation, and it comes to be under the category that Niebuhr calls Christ transforming culture. What is the role of the church in society? Well, Calvin's answer was that the role of the church is to provide the moral guidance for citizens as they shape culture and the state in ways that promote the values of religion, promote justice, promote good order, promote and shape a just and sustainable society. The church is not supposed to run the state. The church is not over against the state as a political minority. The role of the church is to be part of transforming culture that has many voices in it in ways that lead to God's vision. So, that version of Christianity, and Calvin was himself a huge social reformer, interestingly enough. Calvin was not an ordained minister. He trained as a lawyer. He was a very highly educated biblical scholar, fluent in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, as well as French. So he was deeply steeped in both classical literature and biblical literature. He was the leader of the Reforming Church in Geneva. And through his influence, then that way of being church began to spread not only around Switzerland, but into parts of France, then notably to Scotland, from there to Northern Ireland, and from there to us. And then eventually to Korea, but that's another story. Calvin himself was deeply invested in the reforming and the well-being of the city of Geneva. So he was concerned about water and sanitation. He was a fierce advocate for public education at the expense of the city. Public education, notably for girls as well as boys, a very unusual idea in the 16th century. He was also a key leader in the shelter of religious refugees who were pouring into Geneva from France. These were reformed people we sometimes call the Huguenots, who were Calvin himself was from France, was participated in the reforming movement there before he was exiled to Geneva. As these refugees continued to try to find shelter in Geneva, Calvin said, "This is our job. We want to be a city who welcomes refugees." Sound familiar? So here's an example of his using his post as a religious leader to try to get the city, the civic populace, to do what was in his view the right thing. So, baked into the mission of the church then, from a reformed standpoint, is not only doing religious stuff, but engaging in activities that shape and form the society in which the church finds itself. So, the mission of the church comes to be articulated in ways that show this. Now, this statement, called The Great Ends of the Church, is part of our Book of Order. This was written by a group of Presbyterians in the United States called the United Presbyterian Church in North America, the UPNA for short. So Presbyterians, there's a great flow chart somewhere of all the different branches that Presbyterians have been in the United States. We sometimes think about the North and the South, which was the division in 1860 of the Civil War, but there are literally a dozen Presbyterian-type families that have existed. This group is particularly Scottish in heritage, sometimes called the Scots Covenanters. My great-grandmother was one of these people. Among other things, these people did not think church organs were biblically sanctioned. So nor did they think hymnody, in the sense of hymns written by people, was a good idea. The church was to sing the Psalms, and much of the chanted Psalter, the Scottish Psalter that we have remnants of in our hymn book, come out of these people. So on one hand, these people were pretty darn conservative, mostly Western Pennsylvania people, where, as they sometimes say, Presbyterians are more dense than they are in any other part of the country. This, I think, is however, a fascinating document, and I'm so glad that we have retained this piece of our heritage, because it comes out of this conservative group written in 1910. So right on the edge of what comes to be called the social gospel movement in American church life, where Christians are starting to get really ginned up about social reform and public engagement and all that sort of thing. This group writes this: the great ends of the church are the proclamation of the gospel, the shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship of the children of God. So we've got maintenance of divine worship. So we've got evangelism, Christian education, worship, preservation of the truth, right doctrine. Okay, so far, this is like normal church, right? This is what we do, this is what we think we're doing. Now we get to the promotion of social righteousness. So one of the great ends of the church is to get the society to do right, to be right, to get better. In their context, this meant a couple of things. One was a history of abolition, and the other was prohibition. So these people were dedicated teetotalers. Why? Not so much because they thought alcohol in and of itself was evil, but because of the effect of alcohol on the family, of laboring men who would often go into taverns, drink most of their wages, come home with very little. Spousal abuse, neglect of children was rampant in the big cities, and there was deep and abiding concern about the way in which alcohol fueled family disintegration. And that was largely the concern about prohibition. And finally, the exhibition of the kingdom of heaven to the world. So these folks believed that the role of the church was to showcase God's reign by the way they lived, both collectively and individually. So this isn't just my great end as an individual believer. This is the great end of the church. This is what the church is supposed to be engaged in activities that demonstrate what God intends for the relationships, for business practices, for the ways we engage society. So there's that piece of what is the church supposed to be doing? Well, it's supposed to be engaging in these kinds of activities that make the world better. Now, we may disagree on what exactly those means are. We may have a different palette of activities, but I think this is what's baked into our DNA and a good deal of why we show up for these kinds of discussions and debates. Now, that said, how should the church, and this is the church's mission in society. Now let's look at another aspect of this, which is the relationship of church and state. How should the church be related to the civil government? Now, this is a long quote that I'm going to try to read slowly. This comes out of the first Constitution of the Presbyterian Church, which was adopted on May the 21st, 1789 in Philadelphia, when the synods of New York and Pennsylvania formed the General Assembly. What else is happening in 1789? Yes, the United States Constitution is ratified in the same city. So what's going on in terms of the civil government, our federal government being created, and the Presbyterian Church being created as a national denomination are happening. We're swimming in the same water. We're talking the same language. Now, one of the key debates, federally speaking, is the relationship of church and state. And even though the Bill of Rights is a little later on, this discussion is front and center in the constitutional conventions. And here's the Presbyterian answer to that. Our principle is, these are foundational principles, that God alone is Lord of the conscience, and hath left it free from the doctrines and commandments of human beings, it being the conscience. Therefore, we consider the rights of private judgment in all matters that respect religion as universal and unalienable. Okay? The rights of private judgment in religion are universal That means they apply to everybody, and they are unalienable. They cannot be taken away. We do not even wish to see any religious constitution, that is to say, a particular church's either doctrine or book of order or form of governance of that church. We do not wish to see any religious constitution aided by the civil power. We don't want, we're saying, the state to enforce our religious points of view, further than may be necessary for protection and security. That is to say, we want them to enforce laws that would, for example, protect our property or protect us from persecution, and that at the same time be equal and common to all others. So, we do not think that the church should be protected by the state to any extent that is, to the extent that it is protected by the state, that protection should be exactly the same for all religious groups, not just us, including ones we think are really, really wrong. Because these people thought a whole lot of other people were really, really wrong. We still had the Westminster Confession of Faith, which had been only written in the century before, that quite clearly says that the Pope is the Antichrist and that the Roman Catholic Church is close to being the whore of Babylon. So it's not exactly like we're real open-minded, theologically speaking, about other people. But this is the kind of society we want to live in. Now this 18th century language is kind of hard to parse out. But does this, do you see the point here? I just think this is absolutely fascinating. So the notion of what we call the separation of church and state is baked into the Presbyterian Constitution in 1789 in radical form, and puts our way of being church in society. This is a distinctive voice. Not all Christians would have said this or would have thought about it in quite this way. But here we are staking out this approach.
Cynthia,
Yes.
did other religions, Christian religions, have the same type of thing that everybody feels separate from each other? Each denomination, the Baptist, and or was it primarily the Catholic Church that we were trying to separate ourselves?
Well, so are you talking, help me with that question a little bit more, Jane.
Well, this seems so, well, I guess it's the period, so that's
Yeah.
just very kind of radical.
Well, this is really a point about, this is an example of Presbyterians trying to negotiate, on the one hand, being a religious group inside of a civil state that is not controlled by the church, not a state church. So all of these people in the 18th century are only a few generations removed from Europe, where there were still state churches. So there might have been both Lutherans and Catholics in the same general region, but one or the other of those was distinctively linked to the state. You were either in the state church or a minority group. And part of the American religious experiment is, okay, there isn't going to be any state church anymore.
Cynthia, actually, there have been state churches in this country.
Yes, there were, in
Sent
New
people
England.
to jail who didn't attend them.
Yes, and there were, and this is why the Baptists ended up in Rhode Island. Roger Williams was expelled by the Calvinists in New England because he was insufficiently doctrinally pure. There were still state church taxes well into this period until that. It took a while before the real separation of church and state took hold in the United States. That's exactly right. So I'm not sure that answers your initial question. But I mean, so on the one hand, this statement is trying to negotiate being a church in a civil society. The other thing it's trying to negotiate is implicitly a recognition that we are one church among others, and that there are these others out there. And even if we disagree with them, we want all of us to be treated equally. So we want to be protected, and unfortunately, that means that Catholics have to be protected too. Oh, darn. Or Baptists, or Lutherans, or, whomever else. So, okay, so that's church and state. Church in the world. So what are some of the principles that guide us today as we think about, or as I think about what it means to be the church in the world? So this is kind of now my take theologically on how we might talk about this. So first principle, the sovereignty of God. God cares about all aspects of life and creation. God isn't just interested in our souls, in our spiritual welfare, or in our eternal destiny. As Reformed Christians, we've long believed and taught, as with many other Christians, that God cares about all of it. What we call political and what we call religious. Social welfare and spiritual welfare. Because God is God of all. Second, that all people are created in the image and likeness of God. We share a common humanity. God does not love us any more than God loves others. Even though we are Christians, the love of God and God's care extends over everything and everyone. Parenthesis, therefore we're supposed to care about them too. Thus, the command is to love God and neighbor. These two commands are intimately related. And finally, what does God require of us but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God? So these core principles that we actually talk a lot about here are the ones, it seems to me, that we take into our conversations about the issues of the world. So when we talk about the opioid crisis, or about the prison system, or the cash bail bond system, which our stated clerk is very interested in us talking about, what is the principle of loving God and neighbor and loving all as created in God's image mean? What implications do those principles have for these kinds of issues that we face? That's what we talk about. And we will have different ideas about the implications of these general principles to specific issues. And that's great. That's how we are as church, as we negotiate and try to discern through our conversations with one another. What is it that justice requires in this situation, in this day and time? So our mission, as we say here, is to share hope from the heart of the Highlands, to be engaged from this place as part of making the world better, to witness by the work that we do to God's work and in the world and God's desire for us. And we do that by by all kinds of things. By service, by advocacy, by contributions to other agencies, by having classes like this. So I'm going to stop now and let's engage in some conversation about this. Questions back on what I've already said, or where you think this, how you think this works? Yes.
As we confront these issues over the next 2 months, social issues, are there any limitations or constraints that you think about or observe? Then we've talked about the affirmative reasons to get involved in social issues. Do you think there are some constraints that we say, well, you know, maybe not to get too involved in a certain fashion? Do you see any constraints?
Well, and this has continued to be something that Presbyterians have debated, right? So I think it seems to me that congregations like ours almost always agree that service is a good thing, that we ought to be engaged in doing specific things that make things better for other people. Let's take the issue of hunger and poverty as an example. So we do collections for Portland Avenue. We are engaged in a Dare to Care food bank venture with Grace Hope down in Smoketown. We are actively involved in helping people who are experiencing hunger and poverty. What does this say? What about the deep roots of hunger and poverty in our community? Why is it exactly that people don't have enough to eat? Well, they're unemployed, they're underemployed. Why is that? Let's look at what are some of the root causes of hunger. What about the whole question of food deserts? There are parts of this city, as we all know, we've talked about this more, where there simply aren't grocery stores. This is astonishing, frankly, when most of us, our issue is, let's see, which one do I want to go to because they have the best blueberries? You know, right, this is my most pressing problem. Can I get our paper towels a little cheaper at place X than place Y? That's what we think about. That's not what people in West Louisville, especially with limited transportation, think about. So what should we be doing, if anything, to advocate for changes that might address those issues? So that's, service is one thing, advocacy is another. So how do we, is there a role for the congregation in advocating specific kinds of practices or legislation or programs that would change something? What about showing up at city meetings to advocate on behalf of things like that? Is that what we would, and would we ever do that collectively as opposed to individually? So it's one thing for us to talk about, you know, we could show up, we could sign this petition, and do that as individuals. It would be another thing for Highland Presbyterian Church as a church to publicly advocate for something in particular. I'm not sure that I know this congregation has ever done that. The other would be the question of endorsing a politician or a who is engaged in a certain with a certain set of policies and advocacy. And I think pretty clearly most Presbyterian churches, for a variety of reasons, stand back from that. There are at least in theory, some Internal Revenue Service laws that suggest that the church's not-for-profit status means that churches cannot, should not endorse individual politicians. That's a whole topic that, and the reality of that on the ground is a very interesting, something I've observed. It's interesting how that works in different communities and different places. So I think the different congregations have different tolerance for advocacy versus service, and encouraging individual participation versus collective or corporate participation. Okay? So that would be, I think, an answer to your question. Carol?
I was going to mention, we were talking about us doing something collectively, it makes me think of Pride March, where we
Yes.
all, wearing T-shirts and walking as a group, being as a group.
Right.
So,
And there are people in this congregation who have found that difficult. Actually raised that as a question with me. So who decided that? What does that mean? Does that mean Highland has a policy about it? So, I mean, it was just, it was interesting. But yes, that's, Church in the World has been having this conversation about moving from simply supporting good work through our benevolences and education about issues to engaging in some advocacy in the community. Bill?
The thing I struggle with, your example about the food desert, the thing I struggle with is that grocery stores, supermarkets, whatever, are profit-making ventures.
Right.
If there's a profit to be made, there would be one there, wherever it is. West End, South End, wherever. The fact that they can't make a profit is why Kroger closed that store downtown. They weren't making money. So the issue is then not advocating for somebody to move a grocery store in there, but to figure out why these people, whoever they are using that supermarket. Because evidently they're not, otherwise they would be closed. So that is the issue then, one of neglect of providing these things, or is it another issue of needing to educate certain people about healthy eating and how do you cook, and because they're not buying the product, otherwise the store would have closed.
Well,
Digging back beyond what appears on the surface.
yeah. Obviously, it is a matter of profit, and but it becomes a spiral, actually, of as neighborhoods become more and more poor. You have people that actually need more access to low-cost food rather than being stuck with high-cost food, which is what happens in places like Family Dollar stores
Yeah.
that really aren't cheap, or convenience markets. So it becomes a spiral of that makes things worse rather than making it better. In fact, that Kroger store in Old Louisville isn't in the far West End. I mean, it was practically down. The balance of the population of West Louisville is way further west. And sometimes those decisions are, yes, profit, but also fear, lack of knowledge, lack of willingness to take a risk on a community. So there's some strategies trying to be tried to say, there is a market there. There are obviously people that live there that have income. So
Exactly, there are. There are reasonably wealthy neighborhoods in West End. You go on
Yeah.
Northwestern Parkway and North comparatively.
Yeah, there's still income, and there are people that need to eat. So that's why drilling down into these issues, talking about them, trying to say, well, what's the root cause? It's not a simple situation. So how might we get our heads wrapped around it to say what would be, where's a place that we could be engaged in a way that would make a positive difference? That's the kind of question to ask. Is that a simple conversation? No, it's not. Other comments or questions?
They have this, sociology, okay, like, they get permeated. Okay, I go to this place, and they actually will sit me down and talk to me about all kinds of these healthy foods, and you can eat this little paper to me like these foods. But it's only impregnated in that anymore, or just you don't believe that. Why can't they have this program things called WIC? And I see,
Women and infant children.
You know, what I'm saying is, why can't we go down to the middle school and the high school and start teaching these young people how to eat healthy foods?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Why, if we're thinking about promotion of social righteousness, of a well-ordered and healthy society, how is that an issue that's bigger than the immediate food issue? How does that become a part of the education of people from a younger age? What do we want and hope for from our schools? How are services available to people in a variety of ways at times in life? Yeah, why not do that? Why not do that at a different time?
Why
Yeah,
not teach me this stuff in school?
yeah, exactly.
Why? After I get pregnant.
Yeah, yeah.
After pregnant, it's people's tax money.
Yeah.
We're in the bucket paying for these
Right.
people's sex things.
And there's good reason for that, but why not? You're saying let's expand that. So thank you very much.
Problems out there.
So yes, Kevin.
That's good. One comment, I think. Now I leave on Saturday to go to Montreat with the youth again. In a negative way. I just remember back from a couple of. Doodle and I will both be small group leaders. Highland Presbyterian Church always produces small group leaders for these conferences. Last year, I remember the experience being that the themes and the topics were really rather rich. Maybe richer than we've had in some years past. And I kind of went into the conference with an expectation that some of these kind of complicated social justice issues were on the table because of the way the theme was organized, and found that a lot of the youth from churches in the Deep South were less comfortable talking about them. In fact, there was a certain overwhelming value system mentality that politics was not something to be talked about in church, that they were totally separated. And I certainly, recognize that that kind of conversation can easily break down into candidate bashing, and it can kind of become uncivil. But underlying those candidate platforms are really critical issues that I guess there's a part of me that I came away from last year a little disappointed, and partially because I really think that if anyone is going to engage those really harder issues, which we have an opportunity to do this summer, we ought to be able to do it in a civil way, and we have a kind of responsibility to do it, because if we can't really tackle those complex issues in a community where we basically share values and essentially love one another and respect one another, who else can? Because it's not happening in the broader culture. It's kind of, for me, it's a responsibility that we, and I say we, the church, but really I realize that's such a diverse group of people that we're not all exactly in the same place, but it's something we need to be tackling and talking about a lot more, putting ourselves out there a lot more to talk about.
Yeah, it seems to me that as never before, if we can find some ways to to help ourselves learn how to talk about some of these big, complicated, difficult issues in ways that respect difference of opinion, that can begin by naming, what are some of our the common values that we hold, even if the ways we think the implications of those values work differently in the results is really important. That would be a gift that church could provide, which I think, among other things, means that we have to make it okay inside of a conversation like that to actually name and have differences of opinion, rather than assume that, well, in our church there's only one way to think about this. Now, we've not picked up some of the really big, hairy, complicated issues. This is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the summer, and we didn't put migration, immigration up here. That would be an issue that at some point maybe we should be talking about. And migration and immigration and refugees are all different topics and interrelated topics at the same time. But there's a lot of stuff up here. So a criminal justice system. What exactly are some of the policies that we have, and how does the criminal justice system privilege some people and harm others? That's a worthy topic of conversation. The court-appointed special advocates really looks at the whole question of children and youth who need to be cared for in the court system because, largely speaking, their parents are somehow involved in the criminal justice system. How can these folks be cared for? This is not unrelated to the question of homelessness, and not only, so there's at least two issues here. Why do we have homelessness? But also, what are some of the things that we as a city can and should try to do about this seemingly growing problem? That's not unrelated to the opioid crisis. Martin Hall, a member of this congregation, is a researcher at the Kent School, and he studies Appalachia, and this is his area of research. I think it's going to be a great program. Underlying the opioid crisis, and not unrelated to it, of course, is mental health issues. Mental health services was an area that cities and states used to be pretty much involved with, and are now not. And where are we on that as a part of the care that we hope to provide, or issues to think about in our society? Housing issues, not unrelated to homelessness, but kind of a different issue of almost everybody says that the first thing that people who are homeless need is not money but a home. Once you get a home, it turns out all kinds of other social indicators get better. Providing that provides a social stability that is really critical. The tuition subsidy project that Mary Gwen Wheeler is involved with is part of this larger discussion of helping all young people attain higher education. And then finally, that will lead us to Simmons College, and in particular, the mission, the distinctive mission in higher education of an historically valued college or university, which is what Simmons is. So that's our summer. Hope you will come and be part of this conversation and join us. So thank you very much for our beginning.
Great job, setting the stage.
I used to see them on that exact same. Oh, lunch. Basic capsule.
Cynthia.
Whatever.
No problem.